Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. An AP story posted earlier today reads, quote, California's next governor could be a Black conservative who would erase state vaccine and mask mandates, is critical of gun control, disputes the notion of systemic racism in America, and opposes the minimum wage because he says it tramples the free market. Before I introduce my guest, I wanted to give viewers some background. California has a very vibrant recall process, and I learned today that every governor in the last 60 years has faced a recall campaign, but only one was actually recalled, and that was Democrat Gray Davis in 2003, who lost to Republican celebrity Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, it's difficult to recall a Democratic governor in a heavily Democratic state, but in 2003, we had the Enron energy deregulation crisis, and a lot of people suffered. The COVID pandemic may be Gavin Newsom's Enron. To recall a governor, you only need signatures from 12% of the people who voted in the last governor's election. At first, the recall was sputtering along with 50,000 signatures. The issues were Newsom abolishing the death penalty and providing rights to undocumented immigrants. And then came the pandemic. Newsom imposed some of the strictest controls in the nation, which people appreciated at first, but then businesses started hurting and pandemic fatigue set in. It wasn't until November when Newsom was photographed at one of the most expensive restaurants in the country, the French Laundry, enjoying a lavish dinner with friends, totally maskless, that the signatures on the recall petition jumped to 500,000. And now they've exceeded the 1.4 something million they needed in order to qualify. So with me to discuss the recall are two personal friends of mine who I will now introduce, Susie Shannon and Ben Hauck. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
I've known Susie since we helped found SoCal Grassroots, a short-lived progressive organization coming out of the 2004 presidential election. Susie is a Democratic activist, a member of the DNC, the only one from California in 2016, by the way, to support Bernie Sanders, and was the first political director for Sanders' 2020 campaign in California. Susie runs a nonprofit called Poverty Matters and lives in Los Angeles. Ben is also a Democratic activist. He is the newly elected Southern California vice chair of the Progressive Caucus, which is the largest caucus in the California Democratic Party. And he's also an issue activist with whom I've worked on the Divest LA and the Public Bank LA campaigns. He is the senior VP of sales for an optics company and lives in Long Beach. So let's start with you, Susie. There are almost twice as many registered Democrats, 46%, as Republicans, 24%, with 23% of the electorate no party preference. Why are polls showing this recall at 50-50?
I think that a lot of people have been upset with the governor for a while on a number of issues that we are concerned about, for renters, for people who support single-payer health care, for environmentalists. And so I think it's left a lot of apathy here in California. If you see, there is no reason why the poll should be this close. But I think as you mentioned, with the French Laundry and people being really concerned about how the pandemic was treated by the governor, there were a lot of people, and people in small businesses as well, who were upset and who signed this petition to support a recall of the governor. And now it's interesting because the race now is being framed as a Republican takeover. And it is true that the people who put the recall on the ballot are not people that we as progressives would be supporting. They're people who are against rent control, against renters' rights, against single-payer health care, who want a complete corporate takeover of the state of California. But even though this race is being framed as, no on the Republican recall, I think that we see that what our real struggle here is just apathy in the Democratic base. And so, there is this huge rush now to get people to return their ballots. And the thinking is that the more Democrats that return their ballots, the less likely it is that the governor will be recalled. And it really is a struggle against apathy. I have canvassed against this recall and come across, several voters who were apathetic, who, basically were like, I'm kind of still researching this. But I've also come across a lot of people who are in an enthusiastic no, because they understand what's on the line here. And there is a lot on the line, particularly for our environment and for renters and for women's rights.
Ben, I mentioned some things about Larry Elder in the intro, but can you tell the viewers why he is so bad?
Yeah, absolutely. So Larry Elder is a conservative talk show host, radio talk show host. He is a pretty extreme right-winger. He is a climate denier, which, while our state is on fire, is just one of the most outrageous positions you could possibly take. He is against mask mandates for COVID. He takes some positions that would be borderline anti-vax. He's talked a lot about some of these conspiracy theories surrounding the vaccines. He's been multiple times noted that he believes that women exaggerate claims of domestic abuse. He is anti-choice when it comes to women's reproductive rights. He's an enabler of white supremacy. He's talked about the fact that racism is not as big of an issue as many portray it to be. And of course, he is a black man. And of course, if he were to become governor, there's a lot of people saying right now, well, it's okay. The Democrats in the state legislature have a supermajority, so they will be able to override his veto power. Well, as anybody who pays any attention at all to California politics knows, that supermajority does not mean that you have a united front on the Democratic side. Within the Democratic supermajority, you have a more progressive leftist wing, you have a more conservative wing, and you have some people in the Democratic Party who are borderline Republicans. So if you have some of these bills, some of these progressive bills in particular, that are passing by a slim majority, the idea that you're going to be able to get 2/3, basically almost the entire Democratic faction, to vote together to override a veto on a bill that maybe they voted no on originally is pretty asinine. Yet, yes, the legislature would be able to override some of the vetoes, but by and large, we're going to lose a lot of our progressive legislation that we've been working so hard on to pass. And then there's all of the things that a Governor Elder would be able to do from just executive authority. And some of the things that, look, Newsom has been nowhere close to perfect. I have a lot of problems with Governor Newsom, but he has done some things right. He has done some things through executive action, like putting a ban on any new fracking starting in 2024, the things that he's doing to transition California away from internal combustion engines and move us towards electrification of transport. All of those things are good. Maybe not bold enough, but they're good. But those are all things that a Governor Elder could completely eliminate on day one.
Yes, and also there's the issue of the Senate. If Dianne Feinstein should pass away or she should retire, which we've been urging her to do for so many years, then Elder would be able to appoint, at least until the next election, a Republican senator. And there would go the Democratic majority that hangs only by Kamala Harris breaking a tie in the Senate. Susie, you can also speak to some other things that he could do as governor, completely apart from approval by the legislature.
Yeah. So the governor also appoints a lot of our commission. So if you could imagine the majority of our coastal commission being appointed by Larry Elder, or really any Republican that could come in from this recall, it's pretty scary, right? Our homeless coordinating committee includes most of the heads of the departments for the state of California, and they would all be Larry Elder appointees, or any Republican that comes in. So there is a lot to be worried about. Our entire progressive agenda would, for sure be completely wiped off the map. And, I do agree that, for the veto, getting 2/3 can sometimes be a real struggle. We're just trying to do that, even with a lot of bills that are running through the legislature, and having a lot of trouble with that. So I do agree on the veto part as well. But also the governor has a say in our budget, and our May revise. And so I remember when Governor Schwarzenegger took office, he would take the welfare budget and take it down to zero and make the Democrats lift it up basically based on justifications for every single bit of spending. So those are a lot of the things that can happen with a Republican governor. Definitely saw what that looked like under Schwarzenegger. I don't ever want to see that again.
Now, there's two questions on the ballot. One is, how do you vote on the recall? And obviously the majority will win on that. But the second question is, who do you want to replace him? And apparently there's 46 Republicans, because Newsom has managed to keep most of the legitimate Democrats off the ballot. So the Democrats don't have a better choice. And in addition to Larry Elder, you also have Caitlyn Jenner, who didn't get much traction, and Kevin Faulconer, who's the former mayor of San Diego, and some other people, lesser known people. But that person can win just by a plurality. So Newsom's side is basically telling people to vote no on the recall and not choose a second person. Why does he care whether somebody chooses a second person? What's the logic behind that?
So the thinking behind it is that if there were a viable Democrat on the ticket, that the people who are truly upset with Newsom right now, which is a very wide base of voters, that they may get in their head that, hey, I should vote yes on this recall because I want to replace Newsom with said viable candidate. And that if that viable candidate were not able to get a plurality of the vote, then basically those votes for yes on the recall, but for a different candidate, would in effect lead to a Governor Larry Elder. So basically Newsom and their team early on kind of cleared the field. They made it very clear, both spoken and unspoken, that if any viable Democrat ran for the recall election, that they would get crushed by the establishment. So nobody was really willing to take that risk and to run. So they basically made sure that nobody who has any real viability as a Democrat was going to run. So what we've seen now is that the Democrats who have run, by and large, are people who just don't have the ability to win this election. Like we have the Kevin Paffrath, who is a landlord influencer, who's telling people to vote yes on the recall and to vote for him, and that he would be a JFK Democrat, which is all utter bullshit. And then we have like some Green Party candidates, and we have a couple socialists running. But the messaging, unfortunately, right now, and I've even participated in this messaging, is vote no on the recall, and then just don't vote in the second section. And the reason being, again, is that if I say, hey, guys, there's a great socialist candidate on this ticket, vote no on the recall and vote yes for the socialist, or vote for the socialist, you're going to run a risk that some of those people will end up voting yes on the recall and then voting for the socialist, and in effect giving Larry Elder the victory.
Now, how many organizations are fighting this? And can you list some of them? And also talk about how much money is being spent on this recall. I read that Newsom has 600 paid organizers on the ground, which I know is 6 times more than the Sanders campaign had. And Sanders won with 100 paid field organizers.
At the top is obviously the California Democratic Party and SEIU 2015. And there's about $58 million that has been raised on the no side, and about $7.7 million raised for the yes on the recall side. In terms of what's being spent of that money, we don't really know, because the figures actually are not going to come out until after the recall for the filings, the financial filings. But there is a lot of money being spent on the recall. They're at least raised in order to defeat this. And there, we know that toward the end of the campaign, There's going to be a lot of media ads that are going to be run that typically happens at the end of statewide campaigns. So I'm guessing that a lot of the money will be spent on that. The canvassing did start I participated in canvassing last weekend. That was one of the first ones that were running. And then there are independent groups who are kind of financing part of the No on Recall campaign, like Santa Monica Democratic Club is like paying for their own lit and devising their own canvassing. So there are also smaller grassroots organizations. I know Feel the Burn, San Fernando Valley did something over the last weekend, yesterday actually. So there are a lot of smaller grassroots organizations, which is great to see, getting out there, spreading the word for people to vote no on the recall.
Yeah, we're seeing some activity from some progressive groups. On the far left, you have your like DSAs, and they are not necessarily getting directly involved in canvassing, but a lot of their members are participating. And the org itself is communicating to vote no on the recall, which is really important that the left and the progressives turn out for this election and vote no on the recall. But we're also seeing like California Young Dems are putting together a very robust set of phone banks and text banks, and they're planning some canvasses. The Progressive Caucus is co-hosting with a lot of different organizations to plug people in to different canvassing and phone banking events. I know Grassroots HQ is doing a lot of activity. So we're seeing a lot of the smaller progressive groups and Democratic clubs really stepping up and stepping in where there appear to be some gaps where the Newsom campaign is not necessarily hitting, particularly on the left. Where the messaging of, stop the Republican recall doesn't necessarily resonate with your more left-leaning demographics. We want to know why we should be keeping Newsom in place and not that, Republicans bad, Trump bad. That messaging just doesn't work on the left. In terms of some money, I did actually see some recent spending on television advertising. For the month of August, it looks like the Newsom campaign spent $12.8 million versus $5 million from the Republican side. And then the bookings for the last 2 weeks here is $7 million on Newsom's side versus $2.3 million on the Republican side. And prior to August, I read that the spending was like 200 to 1 from Newsom's side versus the Republican side because nobody at that point had really raised enough money to do it. So the Newsom campaign financially should have more than enough money via advertising and via spending on field operation to defeat this recall. But there's just enough anger out there, whether it's really Newsom's fault or not. People are angry about what's happening with COVID. People are angry about what's happening with the climate crisis. There's a lot of things that people are upset about, and sometimes you have somebody take the blame for it who may not have complete control over all of those outcomes. I
think there's two other organizations I do want to mention, because I know that Voto Latino is putting $1 million into reaching out to 600,000 young Latinos in California. And also the Renters Caucus, which I'm a part of that board, has put out the reasons that renters should actually be voting no on the recall, including extending the eviction moratorium and putting a lot of money into the rent relief program here.
I always thought, and I said this to Californians Against Fracking when Newsom was running in 2018, and I worked on Michael Bracamonte's campaign, a little-known candidate who had no chance, but we were saying that we were kind of upset that the nurses endorsed Newsom 2 years before anybody had even declared, based on his promise that he would enact single-payer health care, which he really didn't do. So what I was saying was, why don't you, and I said to Californians Against Fracking at the time, why don't you say you're not going to support him? There were 150 organizations in there, unless he agrees to ban fracking. So I'm kind of wondering, we had another bite at this apple, progressives did. We could have said, okay, we're not going to help you fight the recall unless you promise that you're going to enact CalCare, which is the current single-payer bill on the table. You're going to ban new fracking sooner than 2024 and stop oil extraction sooner than 2045, which we all know is way too late. And you're going to do something, anything, about the homeless and the affordable housing crisis. So obviously that was not done. And progressives kind of just jumped in at the last minute when Elder came in because they thought, oh, the alternative is going to be so much worse. But do you guys know if there was any discussion about progressives banding together and getting all these organizations to sort of do a little extortion here with with Newsom during the recall when he needed us the most?
I have not heard about progressives getting together. I mean, the most that I've heard in terms of a group trying to leverage something here is United Neighbors, who have basically called on the governor to veto Senate bills 9 and 10, which basically are the big housing bills that have come, housing production bills that have come out of the state legislature that don't have any affordable housing and no housing for our homeless community. And I know that there have been several neighborhood groups who have called up to the governor's office, basically saying that they're holding their ballot until they hear from him on how whether or not he's going to veto these two bills.
Bernie Sanders launched an ad today.
At this unprecedented moment in American history, when we're trying to address the crisis of climate change, guarantee health care for all, and pass real immigration reform, the last thing we need is to have some right-wing Republican governor in California. The September 14th recall of Governor Newsom is a bold-faced Republican power grab. Don't let it happen. Please return your ballot or vote no in person by September 14th. Thank you.
Clearly, the governor is trying to motivate progressives to return their ballots in the next 15 days. Now, I know that Democratic Party activists like yourselves are motivated, but what do you hear from the average Bernie voter? And I want to also fold that into a question about Latino voters, because a bunch of Latino Bernie 2020 staffers were interviewed by Newsweek 3 days ago in an article titled, "Why Isn't Gavin Newsom Running His Campaign More Like Bernie Sanders?" And they're saying he's not doing what it takes to get Latino voters. And I know that Latino voters aren't a monolith. I mean, you have young Latinos who are more progressive, and then you have older Latinos who may be small business people or churchgoers who are more conservative. What are you hearing from either your average Bernie voter or Latinos about whether they're going to turn out?
So I do know that there was a poll that Survey USA did that showed that 53% of Latinos actually support the recall. And that was a few weeks ago, a few weeks back. And I think that for everyone was quite shocking. I do think, so comparing the Bernie Sanders campaign to this campaign, it's a little different, right? Because in a primary, you're dividing up Democrats, right? As opposed to an election like this, where it should more or less split along party lines. But I think the issue, particularly with Latinos, is that you have very hardworking people in this country who were very turned off by a lot of things that were going on. One, with the pandemic, because a lot of people can't just Zoom into their job. So they lost their jobs. And then there was a problem with the EDD and unemployment. And so a lot of Latinos and people who are low income were hit very, very hard. And then when you then couple that with the French Laundry, right? And having, going out to dinner and having a $12,000 wine bill. And at a time when people are told that they shouldn't be going to restaurants, and then told that it was an open air restaurant. It turned out that it wasn't. And it was for the birthday party of a real estate lobbyist. That all doesn't sit well with people. So while personally you may not like what the governor has done, or you may not like the governor, it's really important that people understand that they have to put that aside for the sake of the state of California. Okay, because we have renters here who desperately need rental assistance. We need an extension of the eviction moratorium. We need to make sure that our environment is, and even though I know that there's an issue about fracking and the permits coming in, stopping the permits later rather than sooner, we do need to understand that everything we care about is going to be a blank slate at the executive level of the state of California, and that other states will go this way if they see that this is a successful model. So as a testing ground for Republican takeover of the state, I think that it's really important that we understand that regardless of what you think personally about a governor or some of the things that he has done, there are really good things, like as Ben had pointed out, that he's done. But what's going to happen if we get a Republican governor will be shocking.
Can you tell me, Ben, what you've been hearing from regular, say, Bernie voters, progressive voters, but not necessarily activists, people that even were, say, non-voters before the Bernie campaign hit them up and got them excited about politics? And then any Latino voters that you might have talked to. And then I'd like both of you to address the question of the success of something like phone banking and text banking versus door-to-door canvassing, where you can get into these long conversations.
Yeah, on the the Latino point, I saw a statistic that 13% of white Democratic voters have returned their ballots, and it's only 6% for Latino voters so far. So definitely the Latino voters are not turning out, at least early on, as much as their white counterparts, and also Black and Asian voters are also returning ballots at a higher rate. So there definitely seems to be some apathy, some lack of energy there. And I think a lot of it's going to come down to the messaging from Newsom and some of the points that Susie mentioned, where the Latino communities were so heavily hit from the pandemic, and they continue to have infection rates and hospitalization rates that are higher than in other demographics. So Newsom absolutely has a problem there. And it doesn't mean that that's not resolvable. It doesn't mean that those numbers won't come up significantly over these last couple of weeks. And I do know that they are investing in some specific outreach campaigns to the Latino community. So there's still time to save it, but it is getting late, and there are some concerning numbers there. Talking to leftists and to your traditional Bernie voters, I mean, first of all, the stop the Republican recall messaging just does not resonate at all with the left. And it's been just shoved down our throats. The messaging is just all that big stop sign, and all we're hearing is Republican, 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 Republican. That's not what works on the left. The fear Trump doesn't work on the left. The fear Larry Elder doesn't really work on the left. Now, as we're getting closer and closer to the end of this election, and people are starting to realize that it's either we defeat the recall or we have Elder, now progressives are starting to go, oh shit, we really do need to defeat this recall, because this would have an outsized negative impact on the progressive movement, because so many of our bills, so many of the things that we want are going to get defeated by an Elder, or overturned by an Elder, and we probably don't have the strength in the legislature to be able to overcome that. So I'm seeing a bit of an awakening on the left and with progressives. And whereas, if I was reaching out to somebody or doing some messaging to defeat the recall, I'd get a lot of pushback early on. A lot of people who are just very unhappy with Newsom and saying they're going to vote to recall him because they're so unhappy with him. Now that people are really seeing that there's only two outcomes here, Larry Elder or Governor Newsom, that people are stepping up and they're voting no on the recall. So it's definitely improving, but we have a ways to go.
Yeah, they say the only issue that Larry Elder doesn't disagree with the Democrats on is on trade. And it's really funny because when I did my protest, I was the LA point person fighting the TPP. And every time Obama came to town, I did a protest at his fundraiser, knowing that we would get coverage. And I did one outside of a Michelle Obama fundraiser in Hancock Park, and Larry Elder interviewed me, and I destroyed him. Folks. And I'm going to put the link to that interview in the comments because I'm so proud of it. But you could tell he was a real free trader, and he didn't know anything about how horrible the TPP would be. Anyway, back to the messaging. So you're in the Progressive Caucus of the California Democratic Party. You just had a big meeting. Do you have any influence as the largest caucus in the party to somehow get to the governor and his team? And what about you, Susie, having been the first political director for the winning campaign and being also a DNC member Is anyone listening to you about this?
I mean, I think that me and Christine Pelosi, who is also on the DNC, have been making comments about the messaging and the fact that it can't just be about stopping Republicans, because there are Democrats who also support the recall. We need to reach them with messaging on the governor's record and making a case for him keeping his job. So there has been that discussion. I think at the convention, Christine Pelosi made her comments public and, received a little bit of criticism about that. But I think that, the powers that be, meaning the leadership of the California Democratic Party and the governor's campaign, have decided this is the best course of action. For me, I think the polls are so close that I do worry. I'm waiting for the next poll to come out to see where we are now. But it is very worrisome, and I think the fact that so many Democratic ballots have come out for right now, I think it has made people optimistic, but there still is a possibility that the governor could lose here and lose his job. So we need to be, the renters, for the Renters Council, what we did was we made the case for why renters should be supporting Governor Newsom and saying no to the recall. And I think more and more organizations are starting to do that who are not part of maybe the official campaign.
And what about you, Ben? Have you tried through the Progressive Caucus, being the SoCal vice chair, to try to influence the party, to influence the campaign?
We've made an attempt and it has fallen on deaf ears. If you look at some of the internal fights that we have in the party, obviously the Progressive Caucus is constantly at battle with party leadership over a number of different issues. And we struggle to get them to listen to us. One slightly off-topic thing is that we're fighting against the party for taking fossil fuel money. While our state is on fire, while the climate emergency is raging all around us, the party's taking money from Sempra Energy, the entity behind the effort to try to cut net metering and really destroy rooftop solar in our state. And we're taking that money. So the Progressive Caucus and many other environmental caucus and Black caucus and different caucuses within the party are coming together to demand that the party stop taking that money. And we're having a hell of a time getting any traction on that. So they really aren't listening to the left. And so we're finding ourselves in a position where we have to fight. And we're looking at taking direct action against the party to force them to stop taking fossil fuel money. So with that said, we did decide to kind of step back and not stop, but really turn down the volume on some of our fights against the party leadership until we get through the recall campaign.
Right.
We understand the importance of the recall campaign. We understand that the left needs to be supporting the effort to defeat the campaign, even if they're not listening to us, even if they're not messaging to us. We understand our responsibility to step up and step in where there are gaps, where there's enthusiasm gaps, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, it sounds like Susie is not so sure which way this is going to go, and I guess it all depends on turnout. So, Ben, who do you think is more motivated to turn out? Democrats, when Trump is not on the ballot, just because they're saying this guy is the opponent is Trump, or, these Republicans who basically see a chance to get a Republican governor elected through a recall process that could never, ever happen in a general election. I think I have an idea of who's more motivated. And I know those anti-vaxxers, I used to tussle with them when I would go up to Sacramento for Citizen Lobby Day. They had anti-vaxxers in California, tons of them, even before COVID. So, and I did a show last week where they're being funded. The people that are going to the school boards and opposing the mask mandates, they're being funded by the same groups that fund the anti-climate science denial, like, trace it back to the Koch brothers, the Mercers, the DeVoses. And, and they're making league with the white supremacists. It's very scary what's going on out there. And I'm in a red state right now. So what do you think? I mean, if you had to predict today, do you think he's going to be able to pull it off, beat the recall?
So, I'm nervous. The energy on the right is absolutely miles above the energy on the left, or even just with your, standard Democratic voter. But with Democrats outnumbering Republicans by nearly 2-1, as you stated earlier, we don't necessarily have to have the same degree of turnout as the Republicans in order to defeat this. And then when we look at independents, who are obviously, or no party preference, who are obviously a very large voting bloc, you're going to see partisan lean. And in California, that partisan lean is going to lean towards the Democratic side. With that said, there's a big question mark, is just turning out Democrats doesn't necessarily mean that those Democrats are going to be voting no on the recall. I've spoken to a number of Democrats who are going to be voting yes on the recall. Hopefully that number is small, but there are absolutely going to be some Democrats who vote to recall Governor Newsom. So I'm nervous, but if I had to guess right now, I think that it'll get defeated by several points, which is way too close for comfort. But the money's there. This late surge is there. The polling is starting to move in the right direction. So we just need to turn out our people. We need the left to step in and step up. And I think it's going to be close, and it should not be close, but it's going to be a close one.
I think this is really a race against apathy, right? It's not really Democrat versus Republican. It's just getting people to turn in the ballots and to vote no. And the worst thing that we could ever do is think that we have this tied up, because we don't. And as soon as people think that we have enough apathy as it is, we don't want people to think this is a sure thing that we're going to defeat this recall, because it's absolutely not.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let you give the final word, Ben, because today was the last day to register to vote for this special election. I'm sure that maybe that's midnight. Maybe people can still do it there online, register to vote and get your absentee ballot. But the election's in 2 weeks. So what do you want to tell to people?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to speak, mainly to the left, to make sure that you turn in your ballot, to vote no on the recall. My advice is just don't fill out the second section. If you insist on filling out the second section, that's great, as long as you don't vote for Larry Elder. But make sure that no matter what, that you vote no and turn in your ballot. I'm signed up for ballot tracks, and it was incredible how fast, when I dropped it in my mailbox, that one day later it was received, and one day after that it was counted. So all of the fears of USPS delays, I know that different communities would have different types of delays, but right now it seems like the USPS is on it in terms of getting the ballots processed quickly. So if you don't have the time to go take it to a drop location, drop it in your mailbox and get it in now. This is going to be a close race. We have a lot riding on the line. We have a lot of very good progressive legislation that is going to be passed over the next several days and hopefully signed into law by Newsom. And some of that stuff just barely squeaked through. And if there was a Governor Elder and he did a veto on it, I don't believe that we'd be able to get that 2/3 needed in order to save those bills. So please vote no on the recall, get that ballot in as soon as possible. And, we can come back and take aim at Governor Newsom after this whole thing's done and see if we can run somebody against him and win. But now is not the time to put this whole thing at risk.
Okay, well, I want to thank you guys. You're both fantastic progressives. I'm really proud to know you, and I'm so glad you're still there in California fighting the good fight. I myself am here in Red, North Carolina. On Sunday, I'm going to be interviewing John Ager, who is our state representative, a Democrat, who's going to talk about what it's like to be a Democrat in a Republican-controlled legislature. So everything is flipped for me now, but I'm still keeping on doing my thing. And I want to ask people to please share this show. And I'm going to close like I close every time by thanking my guests and telling everybody to keep fighting.